It smelled like Christmas morning and instant death. In the final moments before the deluge, the air hung thick and syrupy sweet over Commercial Street in Boston's North End. For the Italian immigrant families living packed into the tenements, for the dock workers hustling against the January chill, and for the horses pulling their heavy carts, the smell was just part of the background noise, a comforting, slightly cloying aroma that drifted off the massive steel tank looming over the city. It was January 15th, 1919, and the USA was standing on the precipice. The Great War had just ended. The 18th Amendment, Prohibition, was weeks from ratification, and the country was trying to figure out what it meant to be modern. But in a dizzying moment of physics and folly, Boston was about to be served a bizarre and deadly warning about the future, one that involved 2.3 million gallons of sticky, dark, fermenting molasses, a warning that tasted sweet but delivered the crushing force of a tidal wave. The city was cold, a biting, typical New England cold that seeped into the bones. Yet, in the shadow of the 50-foot-tall storage tank owned by the USIA company, the temperature felt almost irrelevant. The massive steel cylinder, built just 4 years prior in 1915, contained a staggering amount of molasses, a byproduct critical to the company's wartime operations. During World War I, this molasses wasn't used for baking or candy. It was fermented into industrial alcohol, a key component for manufacturing munitions, specifically smokeless gunpowder, and eventually rum. Now, with the war over, the product was still a valuable commodity, destined for distilleries to slake the nation's pre-prohibition thirst before the taps ran dry. The tank itself was an ugly, ominous fixture in the lively, congested North End. It sat nestled near the elevated tracks of the Boston Elevated Railway, surrounded by USIA offices, a fire station, a handful of unassuming homes, and the sprawling works of the Purity Distilling Company. Locals, who had complained about the structure's sloppy construction and the unnerving metallic groans it emitted during hot weather, often referred to it sarcastically as the molasses tank. Today the conditions were strange. Just hours before, the temperature had been in the single digits, but a sudden unseasonable thaw had sent the mercury climbing into the mid-40s. A dramatic thermal stress on the structure's poorly riveted seams was the unseen trigger for the catastrophe that was about to unfold. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the noon whistle had just sounded, and life was in full swing. Children were walking home for lunch. Firefighters at Engine 31 were eating their midday meal. Dock workers were taking a quick break. And then, without prolonged warning, a sound like a machine gun being fired was heard. It was not a single blast, but a rapid, rhythmic tearing noise, the sound of hundreds of weak steel rivets shearing off their heads under unbearable pressure. The tank burst. It didn't simply leak or rupture. It exploded with a concussive force that shook buildings blocks away. The initial shock wave was so powerful that it reportedly buckled the elevated train tracks some 20 feet above the street. Witnesses claimed the lid of the massive tank, weighing several tons, shot straight up into the air. And then came the flood. 2.3 million gallons of molasses, a sticky, viscous 12,000-ton mass, shot out of the gaping hole in a thick, churning wave that moved with astonishing speed, an estimated 35 feet per second, or 39 kilometers per hour, at its peak. This wasn't water. It was a dense, heavy fluid, nearly 1.5 times the weight of water, and it formed a dark brown wall of destruction that witnesses estimated reached heights of between 15 and 25 feet. The sheer brute force was incomprehensible. The molasses wave slammed into its immediate surroundings like a brown tsunami. The USIA office building was lifted off its foundation and pulverized. Engine 31 Firehouse, a sturdy brick structure, was demolished, its walls exploding outward and trapping the entire company of men inside. Tenements near the docks were swept away, collapsing under the liquid battering ram. People and animals were simply overwhelmed. Horses were picked up and hurled like rag dolls, breaking free of their harnesses only to be instantly submerged and drowned. Pedestrians were knocked down and, critically, became instantly stuck. The thickness of the molasses, combined with the cold January air that rapidly lowered its temperature and increased its viscosity, turned the wave into a deadly, inescapable trap. Survivors later described the experience as being caught in wet concrete. The scene descended instantly into chaos, marked by the grotesque juxtaposition of the deadly seriousness and the unbelievably bizarre medium of the disaster. Victims struggled, but the more they fought, the deeper they sank into the tar-like muck. "I saw a man struggling in the street, covered with the stuff," one witness, a newspaper reporter named George L. Wiley, later recounted in his dispatch. "He was drowning in molasses. I could hear his cries for help, but there was nothing I could do." The destruction extended for an area of approximately 2 city blocks. A 5-year-old girl named Pasqualina Perrotta was eating lunch in her home when the wall of syrup struck, destroying the building and killing her instantly. A teamster dragging his wagon simply vanished into the brown tide. The initial casualties were horrific. 21 people were killed and 150 injured. But the tragedy was far from over. The rescue operation and the subsequent investigation and legal battle would become a landmark moment in American legal and industrial history, a moment that redefined corporate accountability and the very definition of an act of God. The victims, largely poor Italian immigrants, had been killed not by an explosion of a volatile chemical, but by a culinary staple, a sweet, sticky product that had been turned into a weapon of mass destruction by corporate negligence and the terrifying combination of temperature change and physics. The mystery was this: how could molasses, of all things, do this? And who, in this new age of industry, was going to be held responsible for the day Boston drowned in syrup? The full story delves into the agonizing rescue efforts in the knee-deep cooling molasses, the massive $300,000 lawsuit that defined corporate liability, the groundbreaking engineering analysis that proved negligence, and the bizarre 2-month-long cleanup operation that left the streets of Boston smelling like fermenting candy for decades.
Chapter 2. The Quickening Sands of Syrup. The terrifying speed of the Molasses Flood was matched only by the immediate, paralyzing difficulty of the aftermath. The wave, moving at 35 miles per hour, had subsided in seconds, but the destruction it left behind was static, heavy, and inescapable. The molasses was not a wave of liquid, but a wave of viscous, heavy trauma. The impossible rescue. The first rescuers on the scene were not the city's official personnel, but 116 Navy Cadets from the training ship USS Nantucket, docked nearby. They sprinted several blocks toward the disaster, their training quickly replaced by a bewildering reality. They plunged into the brown, sweet-smelling morass, only to find their movements instantly hampered. The saying, "as slow as molasses in January," was not just an idiom that day. It was a deadly physical law. The rapid drop in temperature after the unseasonable noonday high quickly lowered the temperature of the vast sugar mass, dramatically increasing its viscosity. The molasses turned from a surging river into a thick, sticky goo, a kind of quicksand of syrup. The struggle to move. Rescuers found themselves sinking up to their waists, each step a Herculean effort that drained their strength. They had to fight not just the mess, but the simple brute force of suction. The trapped victims. The scene was a grotesque tableau. People who had been knocked over were now entombed, suffocating slowly in the sticky, dense substance that clogged every orifice and weighed heavily on their chests. A frantic pull on a survivor could tear them loose, but often led to broken bones or internal injuries from the molasses' grip. The firehouse horror was one of the greatest single tragedies. The walls exploded, trapping the firemen inside. Rescuers could hear their muffled cries, but the molasses had filled the wreckage, turning the basement into a thick, deadly grave. Fireman George Leahy was one of the victims, killed while resting in his bunk. The cadets, joined by Boston police, firefighters, and the Red Cross, worked with desperate heroism. They used ropes, crowbars, and even bare hands, often needing to be rescued themselves after becoming stuck. Nurses and doctors established an emergency triage center at nearby Haymarket, treating victims for a shocking mix of injuries: broken limbs from the force of the wave, crushing injuries from debris, and acute molasses inhalation and suffocation. The search for victims was agonizingly slow. The molasses hardened overnight as the temperature plummeted again, turning the wreck site into a landscape of brown, solidified sugar that had to be cut and chiseled away. One of the greatest challenges was identifying the dead. Bodies were so thickly glazed in the dark syrup that they were difficult to recognize. The search continued for 4 grueling days. One body was found 11 days after the explosion, and others were swept out into Boston Harbor, their remains not recovered until 3 or 4 months later, far from the scene of the disaster. The final terrible toll was 21 dead and 150 injured.
The sweetest stain. The cleanup. Once the immediate rescue efforts concluded, the monumental task of cleaning the city began, a task that would define the North End for years. The total area of the molasses field covered several city blocks, coating everything: houses, streets, sidewalks, and the elevated railway tracks. The initial cleanup efforts were nearly useless. Firefighters tried blasting the molasses with fresh water, but the sweet substance only became more diluted and spread further, sticking to surfaces like glue. It was a local resident, or possibly the crew from the remaining Engine 31 fireboat, whose firehouse had been destroyed, who made the key discovery. Salt water was the only effective solvent. The saltwater solution. For weeks, hundreds of workers and fireboats pumped salt water from the harbor, hosing down the entire area. The sheer volume of molasses, 2.3 million gallons, was washed into the city's sewer system and eventually back into Boston Harbor. A brown harbor. For months afterward, the harbor water remained a sickly dark brown color, a silent testament to the disaster. It was a vivid reminder that an industrial product, when released without control, could poison an entire ecosystem. The sticky city. The disaster's residue was tracked everywhere. Rescue workers, spectators, and cleanup crews carried the sticky muck on their boots throughout the city. The molasses was found on subway steps, in the seats of streetcars, on pay telephone handsets, and in countless homes. It was a famous and enduring joke, which wasn't funny to those living through it, that for a time, everything that a Bostonian touched was sticky. The cleanup was an 80,000 man-hours effort that took weeks to clear the main disaster zone and months to truly finish. But the most legendary and lingering effect was the smell. For decades, particularly on warm summer days, the North End would still emit a faintly sweet, fermenting aroma, the ghost of the Great Molasses Flood, a persistent olfactory reminder of the tragedy buried in the soil and basement foundations. The legal war. USA industrial alcohol versus the people. The physical cleanup of the molasses was difficult, but the ensuing legal cleanup was historic and precedent-setting.
The bereaved families and injured survivors, predominantly poor working-class Italian immigrants, filed a massive class action lawsuit, the first of its kind in Massachusetts, against the tank's owner, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA. The amount sought was astronomical for the time, over $1 million, roughly $17 million today. USIA's immediate response was shocking and cynical. They denied all responsibility and played the blame game. The anarchist theory. USIA's lawyers, recognizing the anti-immigrant and anti-radical sentiment in post-World War I America, claimed that the tank had been sabotaged by evilly disposed persons, specifically anarchists who they alleged had planted a bomb inside the tank. This was a direct, calculated attempt to deflect blame onto the very community that had suffered the most. The act of God defense. Failing the anarchist theory, the company's second defense was that the explosion was an unavoidable natural event, an act of God, due to the sudden, drastic temperature swing. The court battle lasted 6 grueling years, from 1919 to 1925. It involved over 1,000 witnesses and 1,500 exhibits. For the first time, the trial relied heavily on expert testimony from engineers, metallurgists, and physicists, a legal strategy that would fundamentally change American jurisprudence. The crucial evidence presented by the plaintiffs focused not on bombs or God, but on negligence and ignorance. Shoddy construction. The tank was hastily erected in 1915 to meet high wartime demand. The construction supervisor, Arthur Geel, was an accountant with no engineering experience and could reportedly not even read a blueprint. Ignoring warnings. Witnesses, including the man who built the foundation, testified that they saw glaring defects. The tank was never properly stress-tested with water. It only had molasses pumped into it, which was 1.5 times denser. From the moment it was filled, the tank groaned and leaked so consistently that children would collect the free molasses dripping from its seams. USIA simply painted the tank brown to mask the leaks, calculating that the cost of lost molasses was less than the cost of proper repair. In 1925, after a monumental effort led by court-appointed auditor Hugh W. Ogden, the verdict was delivered. Ogden's ruling was a landmark victory for corporate accountability. The disaster was caused by structural failure due to the negligence of USIA. The company was ordered to pay a final settlement of $628,000, approximately $10 million in modern money. While no amount could replace the lives lost, the trial's legacy was profound. It set a new, higher standard for expert witness use in court and directly led to new building codes and regulations in Massachusetts and across the United States, mandating that architects and engineers sign off on construction plans and calculations for large-scale industrial projects. This bizarre, sticky death of 21 Bostonians thus became a bitter foundation for modern safety laws, forever changing the relationship between industry and the American public.